The night was unusually quiet in Ouagadougou. Not the kind of quiet that brings peace, but the kind that sits too still, like a breath held too long. The stars blinked faintly above, scattered like secrets across the sky. In the heart of the presidential residence, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in a dimly lit room. His eyes heavy, not from sleep, but from the weight of a nation he carried on his back, and the silent war he had begun to suspect was unfolding within his own walls. He had always known this road would not be paved with gold. Power, to him, was not a crown but a shackle, and trust, that sacred thing, was a candle in a storm, beautiful, fragile, always at risk of being snuffed out by unseen hands. But this quiet, this eerie stillness, it was not ordinary. It was not peace. It was the warning before betrayal. A week before, a soldier he had once fought beside had vanished. No public record, no leave of absence, no transfer. Just gone. The man had been part of his innermost security circle, one of the few people who had seen him cry the night his mother died, one of the few who knew the codes to the underground shelters beneath the state palace. Gone without a trace. Not even. The intelligence unit had answers. That was when the voices began. Not the ones in the shadows, but the ones in his own mind. A quiet whisper of doubt. And doubt, once it takes root, spreads like fire. He tried to dismiss it. He spoke to his men. He walked the halls at midnight. He stared too long into the eyes of those who saluted him. Some held his gaze. Some didn't. But there was one thing he couldn't ignore when he walked past certain doors. Conversation stopped. Not paused? Stopped. Like someone had snapped a wire mid-sentence. He remembered something his father once told him in the village of Bondakai. Before life dragged him into battle. When animals turn on each other, it's not because they forgot they were family, it's because someone fed them fear. What was feeding his men? Who had reached into his circle and sown doubt, envy, betrayal. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a message arrived. An unsigned letter slipped into his personal. Quran, it was short. Just one sentence, written in firm, familiar handwriting. The roots of your tree are rotten. You must dig before the fruit poisons the village. He read it 10 times. On the 11th, he dropped it into the fire. Not out of fear, but because he had already memorized it. That night, he didn't sleep. He opened his old notebooks, reviewed every file, every loyalty check, every security rotation. And that's when he saw it. A pattern, barely visible unless you looked for it. 3 names, 3 men. All had access to his private quarters. All had recently filed identical requests for security adjustments. And all had trained together in a military academy in Dakar years before the revolution. On paper, it meant nothing. In reality, it was everything. He looked up at the ceiling fan spinning above him, slow and hypnotic. His mind raced, not with anger, but with sorrow. These were not strangers. These were brothers. These were men who had risked their lives with him on the battlefield, who had shared cassava and silence and songs with him in the bush. What turns a brother into a traitor? It wasn't just politics, it was deeper. It was the ache of promises, unmet, the hunger of ambition. The lie whispered into desperate ears that they could do better than him, be better than him, lead better than him. And maybe, just maybe, they believed it. But belief without honor is a loaded gun in the wrong hands. So he made a decision. He called no meetings. He raised no alarms. Instead, he chose to watch, to observe, to test the weight of silence around. In that week, he learned more than he ever had in war. He saw the way one of them averted his gaze when asked about deployment. How another began deleting messages in the hallway when he approached. How the third had suddenly changed his nighttime patrol routes without clearance, each action small, each word insignificant. But together they screamed louder than a bullet. It was betrayal not in the explosion, but in the whisper. Traoré stood alone one night under the same stars he once dreamed beneath as a child. The silence was now a wound. But even in that pain, He found clarity. If they were planning to cut the head off the revolution, they had forgotten one thing. He was not afraid of death. But they should have been afraid of the man who had already died many times before every time he was betrayed. Every time he buried a brother, every time his people wept and the world stayed silent, he would not strike. First, not yet. But he would be ready, because the roots were rotten, and he was done waiting for the fruit to fall. There was a day when Ibrahim Traoré would have given his life for the men now under suspicion. Not out of duty, but out of love. There is a sacred bond forged in fire, the kind that only men who have faced death together can understand. In the red dust of Djibo, they had fought side by side, their backs against a tide of militants. They bled on the same soil. They whispered prayers beneath the same sky. They once believed they would die as brothers, but something had shifted. What once felt like loyalty had become performance. The laughter in meetings sounded hollow. The firm handshakes lasted just a second too long, masking hesitation. Every small gesture now felt like a mask struggling to stay on. He didn't want to believe it. He wanted to believe this was paranoia, the sleeplessness of power, the inevitable toll of too many eyes watching from too many directions. But the truth was growing heavier. And it wasn't paranoia when patterns began repeating. Like footsteps in a silent hallway, he called for a closed security. Drill, unusual, unexpected, just before dawn, the compound buzzed. His guards scrambled to execute new protocols. Clearance codes were changed. Security footage was audited. Devices were confiscated temporarily for system updates. Traoré watched from a secured office, sipping bitter black coffee that did nothing to quiet the storm building in his chest. What the audit revealed wasn't treason in its full form. Not yet. But it was movement toward it. Encrypted messages sent through obscure back channels. Surveillance blind spots deliberately exploited. A growing circle of contacts outside official lines, including foreign diplomats from nations known for meddling in Sahel politics. But what crushed him more than the evidence was the names. Names he had toasted with under moonlight, names that echoed in old field songs sung by weary soldiers under makeshift tents. Men who had once wept when he rose to power, not because he held office, but because he reminded them why they had fought at all. What turns a heart like that? Traoré stared at their files for hours, not looking at the evidence, but their photos. Each face told a story he once believed he understood. Then he noticed something strange across their personal statements submitted before enlistment. A single sentence was repeated in all three applications. I fight for a country that must belong to its people again. It was a beautiful sentiment. One Traoré himself believed in. But to see it repeated verbatim in all three forms, it wasn't a coincidence, it was a signal. Someone had planted an idea long before the seeds of betrayal sprouted. This wasn't about one man's thirst for power. This was ideology sharpened in the shadows, and that made it dangerous. He needed to confront one of them, not as a president. As a man, he chose Mamadou, the one he had been closest to. They had trained in the same mud, shared meals, mourned together. Mamadou once saved him from a sniper's bullet by pushing him into a ditch outside Kaya. If there was a fragment of the past left, it would be found in him. They met at dusk, under the old neem tree behind the training field. A tree so ancient. Their elders said it remembered every death the land had seen. There were no guards, no weapons. Just two men who had once called each other brother. You know why I'm here? Traoré said softly. Ma'am, Adio, you didn't answer at first. He looked down at the earth, his boots half covered in dust. We started this together, he finally said. But you left us behind. Traoré's voice did not rise. I carried all of you with me. No, Mamadou replied. You carried the idea of us, not us. We bled so you could sit in that chair, but now you sit there alone. Traoré stepped closer. You think this chair is freedom? This chair is a prison with the doors ripped off. I see the ghosts of our dead every night. I hear them in my sleep. You think I forgot them? I live for them. Mamadou's eyes flickered. Then why are our mothers still hungry? Why are our children still afraid? You speak of sovereignty, but the chains just changed hands. Silence. There was pain in both their voices, but one held betrayal. The other held heartbreak. They promised you power, didn't they? Traore asked. Mamadou's shoulders tensed. You think you'll lead better than me? Traore pressed. Maybe you will. But not like this. Not in the shadows. Not with foreign hands pulling your strings. Mamadou clenched his jaw. We were tired of waiting. Traore looked up at the neem branches dancing in the wind. Then you should have told me. You should have faced me with truth, not with silence. He turned to leave, but then paused. What you're about to do will burn this country, and the people pulling your strings will watch it burn from glass towers. But they'll never step in to save you. They'll let you die in the ashes. Mamadou didn't answer, but his hand trembled. As Traore walked back toward the palace, something heavy settled in his chest. It wasn't rage. It was mourning. He had just buried another brother, but he knew now. The coup was real, and it was close. The storm was not coming. It was already here. And he was done pleading. He would face it. Not with fear, but with fire. Let them come. And for those watching this story unfold, let one phrase echo louder than bullets, louder than betrayal. Real strength is forged in silence, not in schemes. Say it in the comments. Let the world know. Let the traitors see. In the quiet hours before dawn, the presidential compound was silent, but the silence no longer unnerved him. Ibrahim Traoré had entered a new state of being. Gone was the hesitation, the ache of disbelief. In its place stood something colder, calmer. A soldier once again, not of the battlefield, but of truth. He didn't alert the public. He didn't make arrests, not yet. He waited because exposing a coup is not the same as defeating it. A fire lit too early dies before it spreads. He needed the right moment. The moment when betrayal would reveal itself fully, without disguise, without defense. He initiated a false directive. An internal communication, encrypted, fed to just 3 people, one of them being Mamadou. The message outlined a fictitious movement of the presidential motorcade, a transfer of key documents and a reshuffling of command in the northern provinces. None of it was real. But if it leaked, he would know. The trap was set within 12 hours. One of Burkina Faso's most hostile radio frequencies operated anonymously, but known to be funded externally broadcasted parts of the plan. Word for word, that was it. The line had been crossed. But instead of fury, he felt something else. Relief. Now the masks were off. Now he could begin. He summoned his closest, most trusted allies. Men and women who had risen not through connections or power, but through grit, loyalty, and sacrifice. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't brand the act as treason just yet. He simply handed them the evidence, the communications, the surveillance photos, the timelines. What stunned him most was not the act itself. It was the level of orchestration. Foreign names hidden behind fake NGOs. Strategists offering quiet support in exchange for control of mining rights. Promises of luxury villas in Abidjan. A clear, structured blueprint to replace Traoré with a puppet leader. The men he had once trusted were not merely dissenters. They were recruits in a quiet foreign war. And they didn't even see it. He spoke to his team, his voice steady. We will not strike with violence. We will strike with clarity. That night, a private meeting was called. All senior officers. In attendance, Mamadou too. The same men who had conspired now sat just feet away from him, unaware that their every word had already been read. Every gesture already studied. He stood before them, not in military attire, but in plain robes. The kind his mother once sewed when he was a boy. He spoke without a script. I did not fight to become a president, he began. I fought because I couldn't stand to see our mothers burying their sons while others counted our gold. The room was still. I believed we were building something together. Not for power, not for glory, but so no child would go to sleep with the sound of gunfire as a lullaby. I thought we were one heartbeat. Then his voice dropped. "But hearts. Don't betray." He turned slowly, then dropped the first photo on the table. Mamadou receiving a briefcase from an unnamed foreign agent. The second, a transcript of a message coordinating movement near the presidential convoy. The third, a signed letter offering mining access in exchange for political support post-coup. One by one, the conspirators went pale. Not because of the evidence, but because of what came next. Traore didn't call for their arrest. He didn't scream. He didn't order retaliation. Instead, he said, "I forgive you." It landed heavier than any punishment. "I forgive you because I understand what hunger does to a man. I understand what desperation turns into. But forgiveness does not mean forgetfulness. You will step down. You will disappear. You will never again whisper betrayal into this land." The silence in the room was louder than thunder. Mamadou stood. "You have no proof this goes beyond us." Traore turned slowly. "I have all the proof. But that's not what matters. What matters is that your hearts forgot the people. And for that you've already lost." Then he said the words that would be repeated in whispers, then in headlines, then in villages across the country. "Real strength is forged in silence, not in schemes." He walked out of the room. In the days that followed, the traitors vanished from public sight. Some left the country. Others were quietly dismissed, replaced by young, hungry officers who still remembered what it meant to serve, not to conquer. The foreign hands retreated, at least for now. The people never knew the full truth. And perhaps that was for the best, because sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with guns or noise. They are fought in silence, in shadows, in the hearts of those who refuse to be broken. Traore didn't need to win headlines. He had won something deeper. He had reclaimed the soul of his revolution. Rain began to fall the day after the confrontation. Not the kind of rain that screams with thunder, but a soft, steady weeping from the sky. It rolled down the windows of the State House in silent rivulets, as if the earth itself was mourning something invisible. For Traore, it was fitting. The air itself seemed to understand what had just been lost. He did not celebrate the survival of his presidency. There were no secret grins, no private toasts. Instead, he went walking through the mud-soaked streets without an escort. Wrapped in a simple cloak hood pulled low, he passed people who didn't recognize him. Or maybe they did, and chose to leave him to his silence. He passed children with bare feet, chasing puddles. He passed women with baskets on their heads, their backs bowed under the weight of survival. He passed men staring out of makeshift shops, faces carved by hardship. And he remembered again what this was all for. Power, he had come to learn, is not about how many people stand to salute you. It is about how many still believe in you when the lights go out. One old man stopped him. Wrinkled fingers, cloudy eyes, and a voice like cracked stone. "You look tired, son," the elder said. "I am," Traore replied. "You're fighting shadows, aren't you?" Traore looked at him, startled. "How did you know?" The old man chuckled. "Because I fought. Them too, not with guns, with patience, with silence. You can't kill a shadow, boy. You can only stop it from finding a home in you." The words stayed with him long after he left. He returned to the palace, not to command, but to remember. He walked through the training fields. He visited the rooms where fallen comrades once slept. He read letters left behind by soldiers who had died. Believing they were defending something pure, he began speaking more quietly in meetings, listening longer, watching how others spoke when they thought no one noticed. He shifted not the power structure but the spirit within it. Those who had survived the attempted betrayal were not merely lucky, they were tested. And many passed it. It was during this time that he noticed something small, almost insignificant. A new recruit, no older than 22, had begun standing outside the orphanage near Sector 15 during his off-duty hours. Rain or heat, he stood there, watching, waiting. One evening, Traore approached him. Disguised, quiet. "What are you doing here?" he asked. The soldier stiffened. "Protecting them." "From who?" From those who think these children don't matter. Traore studied his face. There was no arrogance. Just fire. What's your name? Coolably. What do you believe in, Coolably? The young man turned. That my mother's tears weren't in vain. She lost 2 sons to war. I will not let her lose her faith. That night, Traore wrote his name in his private journal. Not for reward. For remembrance, he began to see them again, the real ones. Not the men of influence or polished uniforms, but the quiet warriors. The drivers who delivered food to the front lines with prayers whispered beneath their breath. The medics who volunteered in forgotten villages. The women who trained not for medals but to protect their daughters from being taken. These were the defenders of Burkina Faso. Not the men in conference rooms who planned coups with foreign agents and drank imported wine while doing it. He realized something then, something he would never speak aloud, but carried like an unshakable truth. The strength of a nation is not measured in its military hardware. It is measured in how many people are willing to bleed for a truth that can't be bought. And in that realization came the most painful part, knowing that the men who had tried to topple him were once counted among that number. He still saw Mamadou sometimes in his dreams. Not as a traitor, but as the boy who once shielded him from shrapnel. He still remembered the sound of his voice, singing old field songs by firelight. And it hurt more than anything that those songs now felt hollow, but that pain had taught him something greater. Loyalty isn't proven by who stands beside you in power. It is proven by who stays with you when power begins to rot. He met with the families of those who had left. He offered no lies, he offered no vengeance, just honesty. Some wept, others said nothing. But most thanked him not for punishing their sons, but for letting them walk away with dignity. It was the least he could do. They had been betrayed, but not erased. The days passed slowly. And in those days, something began to bloom. Not trust. That would take time. But belief that even in a world soaked in betrayal, there are still those who choose to stand in the rain, not for applause, not for power, but because it is the right thing to do. And for those listening now, let this be the cry that rises above the noise. Real strength is forged in silence, not in schemes. If you believe that, write it in the comments. Let it echo for the ones who still carry the fire quietly in their hearts. Months passed. The heat in Ouagadougou returned with its usual relentlessness, but the fire within the palace had changed. It burned not with suspicion now, but with something steadier. Something truer. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of the presidential garden one morning. The first time he had returned there since the night the truth nearly tore his leadership apart. The baobab tree stood unmoved, indifferent to the human storms that came and went. A single bird sang in the stillness, cutting through the silence like a reminder that life somehow always continued. He thought back to that first whisper of betrayal, how it curled around him in the darkness like smoke, how it clawed at his heart, not because of fear, but because of the unbearable weight of knowing it had come from his own. And now, here he stood, not untouched, not unscathed, but unbroken. The nation had shifted. Not in grand declarations, but in small, unseen ways. Koulibaly, the young recruit, had risen not through favor, but through merit. His name had begun to echo softly in training halls, spoken by those who still believed in sacrifice. The orphanage near Sector 15 now had round-the-clock protection. Not because it was strategic, but because the children there deserved to feel safe. Traore had made no public announcement about the failed coup. The people had felt the tremor, but he chose to let truth settle like dust, in time, in silence. He walked more often now, alone, through the neighborhoods others had long forgotten. He sat with the broken. He listened to the mothers who had buried their sons. And he held the hands of farmers who had nothing but calluses and pride. He did not offer promises. He offered presence. And presence in a world drowning in speeches was its own kind of revolution. One afternoon, he visited the outskirts of Bobo Dioulasso, a place where red clay swallowed the solace of your shoes and laughter, though rare, sounded like music you hadn't heard in years. There, an elder woman placed her hand on his chest and said, You still carry the wound, don't you? He nodded. It means your heart still works. She walked away, leaving behind a truth heavier than any briefing, more sacred than any military code. He spent that evening alone by a small fire, staring into the flame, not as a soldier, not as a president, just a man, stripped of titles, searching for peace. And somewhere in that fire, he saw the faces of the men who had betrayed him, not as enemies, but as lost pieces of himself. Men who once believed, then forgot why. Men whose names would never again be spoken in his inner circle, but whose stories he would carry quietly, like old scars that no longer bleed but never truly heal. Forgiveness had not erased what they had done, but it had spared him from becoming like them, because power, he knew now more than ever, does not corrupt all men. Only the ones who confuse it with worth. His worth was not in the seat he held. It was in the people who still knelt to pray in broken mosques, in the young girls who now trained alongside boys in defense schools, in the wounded soldiers who whispered his name not out of obligation, but out of memory. Burkina Faso was far from healed, but it was breathing, and every breath was a small act of defiance against the forces that had tried to suffocate it. Traoré returned to the capital the next morning with nothing but a small piece of charcoal tucked in his pocket, a gift from a child who said it would keep him brave. He kept it on his desk, beside the Quran, as a reminder that even the smallest things could carry the greatest strength. That night, he wrote a letter, not to his enemies, not to his allies, but to himself. He wrote of silence, of pain, of trust betrayed and slowly rebuilt, of nights spent doubting and mornings spent believing again. He folded it, sealed it, and placed it in a drawer marked, "Open only when I forget why I began." He hoped he would never need to open it. And so the story of the betrayal that nearly tore his soul apart became a silent foundation beneath his feet. Not spoken of in headlines, not sung in anthems, but woven into the spirit of a leader who had survived not through violence or vengeance, but through clarity, mercy, and conviction. The world may never know the full story, but those who walk the streets of Burkina Faso know this much. The revolution did not die. It learned to breathe in silence. And for every viewer who still believes in quiet strength, in silent victories, in battles fought without the need for applause, know this: real strength is forged in silence, not in schemes. Write it below. Let the world see it one more time.